Hello, I'm 20% into Fool's Fate up to Chapter 8, and we have several developments to talk about, but I'll first start out talking about how I loved the prologue of this book and how we're already getting a strong sense established of the theme of fate and that of choice. Every small, unselfish action nudges the world into a better path. An accumulation of small acts can change the world. So there's already so much about the question of fate, about dragons, and about the Farseer heir. And the book begins in springtime. And I'm just going to go through some of the developments so far in summary, but I really want to get into the themes. Some of the developments so far. Webb knows who Fitz is. Before boarding the ship to the Out Islands, Fitz and Shade team up together, and they effectively prevent Fool from boarding. Not only do they prevent Fool from boarding the ship, they also prevent Starling, and I have some predictions about all that. There's a wonderful sword bonding scene between Dutiful and Fitz in which they have chivalry and Verity swords, and that is heartbreaking as Fitz is not able to carry either sword without giving himself away. He has to keep himself in secret. Once aboard the ship, Vic ends up having terrible seasickness, and this is not only a problem for the skill coterie, but the nightmares seem to be having influence over the sailors, and this might, in fact, cause some type of mutiny to stir up with other sailors because they're under that influence. Oh, there is the most unusual butterfly flying by. Okay, we then get some developments with Nettle, who has this incredible mastery over skill dreaming, a type of skill magic that she is not aware is magic, and she helps to soothe Vic from these nightmares. We also get quite a bit about the skill coterie versus the wit coterie, and we also have a scene in which Fitz reveals himself to Burrich through Nettle. Those are just some of the summarized developments so far, but I'm going to go ahead and get into the themes where I can get into this a little bit more in depth. Now, I see one of the themes as being secrecy fatigue. I was tired of my secrets, too tired to protect them anymore. Now, this has been building for a while. Fitz has been tired of carrying the weight of these secrets, and I think the big push against him revealing everything, full stop, is Shade. Shade basically tells Fitz that as a bastard, he is born for deception. But we understand this as a cycle, and this is going to be another theme I'm going to talk about here in a bit, but it has to do with the appeal to tradition or cyclical abuse, but it's not necessarily a cyclical abuse that one is conscious of perpetuating. It's more that people do as they were taught. And this is certainly the case when it comes to Shade, because Shade is using Fitz, and it breaks Fitz's heart to know that Shade is using him, loves him, but this is what was done to Shade. So in Shade's mind, this is what must be done. This is what must be done in terms of being dutiful. Not dutiful, the character, but having loyalty to the Farseer throne. And so in Shade's mind, this is all for the higher good. But on the other hand of this secrecy fatigue and the sense of duty and honor is Webb. Webb is having a strong influence over Fitz because he knows Fitz's identity. And he's trying to influence Fitz to consider that maybe keeping himself a secret, keeping his identity a secret, isn't doing anyone any favors, and that Swift, in turn, trying to hide who he is, trying to repress his wit abilities, is almost a form of abuse when it comes to how Burrich is raising him. And he has Fitz question the way that Burrich has raised him. So this is, again, bringing up this cyclical abuse, but again, not like an overt physical abuse, but more a way of not recognizing that you're passing down behaviors or ideas that are repressive and mentally harmful without maybe realizing it because it was done to you in the past. But as Fitz is having this secrecy fatigue, I think it's actually drawing him closer to Webb. He and Webb are becoming closer. And there is talk about how he feels that Webb is courting him. That's the word he uses, trying to court him, trying to gain him into his confidence. But in turn, I think Fitz finds it somewhat of a relief to be able to be free, to be himself, not to have to be Badgerlock, like to be Fitz chivalry. And he ends up revealing himself to Burrich, which was a huge risk, especially because he doesn't seem to want to reveal himself to Nettle, and that seems to frustrate Nettle. And he doesn't want to reveal himself to Molly. And I'm thinking, how are you going to prevent that? One of my predictions, I'll go ahead and give away right now, is that it's all going to be out in the open, full stop, by the end of this book. I would be very surprised if Fitz is keeping himself in secret in any way by the end, but I guess I'll find out. He is so tired of maintaining this false identity, of deceiving others, and yet he's still doing it. When he's doing it to Shade, which I find interesting, because Shade is the one who wants him to be deceiving everyone else, but of course Shade wants the power, he wants the control, and yet...
You look so cute.
Thank you.
This is funny.
It's the only way I could film.
People need to see what's behind the scenes.
Okay, got a little distracted by real life stuff for a second. What was I saying? Yes, so as Shade wants Fitz to continue this role of being the deceptive bastard, he doesn't know that Fitz is actually manipulating Shade to some degree with Nettle. He allows Shade to know that he is skill dreaming with Nettle, but he manipulates Shade into thinking that Nettle could be used for the better good, could be used by them by being a solo player. In other words, they're using Nettle together. That's the narrative he wants Shade to believe, when in fact Fitz is trying to protect Nettle from being used as he was used. There's so much heartbreak in all that because he knows that Shade cares about him and is still going to do what he's going to do. Next theme I want to go into, which is a bit related to all of these things, and that's irony and shame. And that is specifically when Fitz tries to send Swift back home, and he says the line, "You've no right to leave people who love you in suspense about your fate." Really interesting that he is saying that to Swift, telling Swift he needs to go back to his father and he shouldn't deceive his father, when in fact that's what Fitz did to Burrich by deceiving Burrich by seeming to be dead all these years. And not only that, but Webb brings up what he did to Patience, and that brings up a lot of guilt, a lot of shame for Fitz. Quite a bit of irony in the relationship between Swift and Fitz. It also seems to be a subtle way in which Fitz is probably longing to reveal himself. There is a section or a part in the book so far in which Fitz makes it known that he spoke to his father or made some kind of connection with his father, and Swift said, How would you be able to do that? That's impossible. We're already aboard the ship. There's no way you could have communicated with my father. And it's not even that subtle when it comes to Nettle, except that he says that he knew her father way before she was born. And in that way, he feels like he's letting her deceive herself. There's probably more to say about irony and shame, but I'm going to pivot now to talk about connections that go against the grain. And I think this very much relates to secrecy and duty, because we have a connection that's forming, a bond that's forming between Fitz and Nettle. And I found it interesting that as Burrich goes out, sadly blind and struggling with alcohol abuse, he goes out trying to find Swift. And during this time of absence, of Nettle not being with her father, she seems to be growing closer and closer to Fitz. And I also suspect that Fitz and Swift are going to be growing closer and closer in this book, even though Swift is somewhat reserved with Fitz or feels like he's been shamed by Fitz in the way that Fitz has tried to send him home and tried to make him go back to being a repressed, witted person. There's also the connection between Fitz and Webb, which I've hinted at or talked about already a little bit, but that is a bit of an unconventional connection, especially as Webb knows everything. Yet I think, again, this is partly what draws Fitz to Webb, but it's more than that too. Webb is very powerful when it comes to the wit magic. His warm serenity pulled around me, diluting my anxiety and weariness. If this was the wit, he was using it in a way I'd never experienced before. This was as simple and natural as the warmth of breath. And not only does Wit have this incredible influence around other people, but he's able to use his bird to scout out ahead. So he is quite an important figure in this book. And there is question about how he's using this secrecy to his advantage, or whether it would disadvantage Webb to reveal the secret of who Fitz is. Shade is very distrusting of Webb, whereas Dutiful is all in on trusting Webb and encouraging a friendship to form between Webb and Fitz. And this brings up some tension between Dutiful and Shade, which I find really interesting, because Shade is of the belief that the skill magic is the superior magic. It's his hereditary magic as heir to the Farseer throne. And Dutiful pushes back that the wit is also his hereditary magic. I love that line. And I love the way that Dutiful is not going to be cowed so easily. Dutiful is going to put his foot down, be assertive. So I thought that was very well handled there. And we know at this point that the wit coterie with Webb and Swift and Civil and Civil's cat and Dutiful and a minstrel character, that this coterie is proving itself to be maybe more powerful than the skill coterie. It is revealing quite a bit about the wit magic that we didn't know before. There's so much more to know. And there's also this question about whether the wit truly did run through the Farseer line. I thought that was an interesting point as well. And I guess the last one I could say for connections that go against the grain is that between Thick and Nettle, as Nettle still dreams and helps to soothe poor Thick, sees him as a kitten. And through Thick's perspective, he sees Nettle as his mother, as his very elderly mother. So that's what I have so far. My crazy prediction, and I'm terrible when it comes to predictions, but my prediction, in addition to the idea that Fitz's identity is just going to be full-blown known by everybody by the end of the book, is that there's going to be a live ship situation that will bring Full and Starling and Burrich to the scene. And maybe in that way bring the war back to the forefront, the war between the Chalcedeans and Bingtown, because there was so much mention about this war in the last book, and it seems to have fallen completely by the wayside so far in this book, but that would bring it back to the forefront. So that's my crazy, outlandish prediction for right now, and I am excited to continue. Hopefully I'm not too dark in this image, but at least you have the beautiful scenery behind me. As far as my experience, I'll just go ahead and say something that is pretty basic in terms of Robin Hobb's gift as a writer, which we know at this point, but truly so natural in developing character conflict through conversation. She knows each of her characters' blind spots and weak points, and I love how she just so naturally brings that up in conversation between characters. So I'm loving that in the story so far. But I will go ahead and add that one struggle I've had with this book so far is the presence of Thick. Even though I think that Thick is a very realistic character and brings that realistic representation into this story, I still struggle with the realism. In fact, I struggle reading about bodily fluids, even from the first chapter into recent chapters with the seasickness. Even though it is realistic, like I said, it's just something I personally struggle with. But otherwise, I am enjoying the story so far, and I am curious to see where it goes. Hello, I am back from Costa Rica and I'm further into Fool's Feet. I have been reading the Kindle version. It's been easier for traveling and other things, but I do like to have the physical edition to check in on. And I am a little ways into chapter 14, just a couple of pages in. So I'm going to try to keep my thoughts up to chapter 14 and go with the same format I did last time, where I talk in broad strokes about the developments that are happening, then talk about some of the deeper conversations that I am perceiving in the story and how I'm experiencing it. So broad strokes, we have gone on the journey. We have arrived at the Out Islands and 3 different locations when it comes to the Out Islands. So we arrive at a place called Xylake, which is where we encounter many of the men, the clansmen, and that's where we learn that there's conflict about Dutiful's mission, because some of the men in the Out Islands, they perceive a oath pact with Icefire. They think of him as a dragon that offers protection to the people, and therefore if Dutiful murders Icefire, they might feel inclined to seek revenge on Dutiful. And so this puts Dutiful in a difficult place, because on the one hand, if he doesn't go on with this quest, that proves him to be a coward, dishonorable, not following through on his promise to Eliania. And yet, if he does succeed, then that puts him at odds with the people of the Out Islands and possibly brews a war. That is a conversation that happens. And then we also go to the mother's house. This is something that Eliania's uncle proposes, and he feels that he has a way to mitigate the situation with the men. They arrive at the mother's house, and this is where we encounter Eliania bare-breasted. We see some of the more interesting gendered politics there, meet the Great Mother, and then some other developments that happen along the way include poor Thick continuing to be sick and miserable, Webb showcasing his wit calming abilities, which is something that Fitz didn't know about. We also learn through Nettle how Burrich responds to Fitz, to knowing that Fitz is alive, and how he went to the Six Duchies, clearly encountered the Fool, and probably Kettricken talked it over, and it seems like he is in a better place, which is very sweet and bittersweet, actually. There's another betrothal ceremony that takes place there at the mother's house. At that island, we learn about the power of land, how important that is to the women or to the Nartuska, and we see the beauty of it, this area with hot springs, with gorgeous pastures, and we encounter Hedna, who is hiding out. And of course, Elianya's uncle is trying to hide this, saying, no, that couldn't be her. And Elianya looks uncomfortable. I have some thoughts about that I'll bring up in a little bit. We also have this fantastic scene when Webb scolds Swift for bonding or attempting to bond with an animal without giving it enough thought and care that is needed when it comes to the wit bonding between man and animal. There's a lot said about that I really appreciated. And then Dutiful finds out about Nettle. He finds out he has a cousin, and he's quite upset about that. Fantastic conversation we should get into. And we also bring up conversation about Burrich being able to skill seal and this ability that might be useful in the future, perhaps. And then when we arrive at the island where Icefire resides, the Aslajav Island, Full happens to be there already in his black and white attire. And then we also have memory stones that include the memories of forged ones. Also, Thick has a cough that seems serious at this point, and I have concerns about that. I've started to warm up to him quite a bit in this story, whereas it was difficult for me to get into his scenes at the beginning. And so I think I will be upset if he ends up passing away, but I think that's a very likely possibility. All right, now to talk about some of the deeper conversations that are happening in this book. What is going on with this Icefire quest? At this point, I am starting to wonder if this was the agenda all along, if Elianya and her uncle and Henja have been plotting all along to get Dutiful to go on this quest before they even arrived at the Six Duchies, and that maybe this conflict that escalated between Dutiful and Elianya was just a way that Elianya used in order to provoke Dutiful to go on this quest. I think that could be a possibility, and I'm wondering if there are connections there with the Pale Woman, like maybe Hedna is in connection with the Pale Woman, or maybe she is the Pale Woman. That seems doubtful. But something odd is going on there, and it does seem to be separate from what the rest of the Out Islands people are wanting, as there is so much conflict with the idea of this quest. And also, why are Elianya's mother and sister detained? Elianya's uncle brushed over that, but I do wonder if that has some connection to this as well. There are so many questions about that. In fact, we've been wondering since the beginning of book 2, why has Elianya's mother not been part of this betrothal process? That seems to be very odd coming from this culture, which is a matriarchy. And there are so many mentions about the past Red Ship Wars and what it has done to the Out Islands. So there seems to be a lot of connection there, not to mention the memory stones. So I see many elements that seem disparate actually be connected in some way. Let's see. I do wonder about the hate to love thing, even though I think I already kind of alluded to this. I was liking the dynamic between Elianya and Dutiful, how it seems like there is chemistry there, but I do question it. I do question whether Elianya really does reciprocate Dutiful's feelings for her, if he does have feelings for her, because I wonder how much is at stake for him to go on this quest. And she's uncomfortable with the Full. It feels like there's a reason for that. And then I'm also thinking about the tattoo situation. She has tattoos on her back. Full has tattoos on his back. So there certainly is something deeper brewing here. I don't know where it's going. And I'm the worst when it comes to understanding plot stuff. Like, I'm the worst at predicting things or seeing things that should be obvious, with the exception of catching who Chade's page was last book. I want to bring up a couple of things I have loved so far in the last few chapters. I loved the conversation that Chade and Dutiful had with Elianya's uncle when he asks if he can escort them to the mother house, and he says he can, mitigate that situation with the men who were upset about this quest. Chade just digs in. He challenges back this whole prospect of marriage, whether Dutiful is bound to marry Elianya if he goes on this quest, that he's going to do it because he's not going to back down from this challenge. But afterward, there's no guarantee that he has to marry Elianya, and you could tell the uncle feels threatened by this. He needs Dutiful to be in this for Elianya, But the way that Chade was pushing back was so good. Get him, Chade, get him. I also love the conversation that comes up when Dutiful discovers Nettle. First of all, I love the scene when Dutiful and Nettle meet for the first time. And even though they're cousins, in a way, they're kind of like half siblings. And we know that. But there's this whole entire betrayal that Dutiful feels with Chade and Fitz keeping things from him. And I think this is important because, as I talked about in the beginning of this book, we have so much secrecy fatigue going on with Fitz. And we're seeing the ramifications of it. We're seeing how it hurts other people. Even if he's doing it in a way that he feels he is doing what is best for others, in fact, it could be perceived as a betrayal. And he can't help but validate what Dutiful is feeling. And it's heartbreaking that Chade has to go down on his knees because he knows he lied to Dutiful. He was caught in a lie. And he basically says, I honor you as king, and I have since the day you were born or conceived or whatever. And it's not quite enough for Dutiful. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that Dutiful is not allowing Chade to have the same boundary pushing with him as he did with Fitz. Fitz just accepted it. Fitz accepted being used his whole life, and he seemed to understand the greater good of why he was being used. But with Dutiful, he's not going to be so easily pushed around. And in that way, Fitz sees Dutiful as being a king already, as somebody who is already growing into that role, growing into his crown. But it also shows another option, another way, that maybe you don't have to be used in order to move the path forward for the greater good. I mean, there are frequently conversations in fantasy about whether the ends justify the means. And in this case, we're shown that maybe that doesn't have to be framed that way. Maybe we can figure out another path. Maybe there is a way in which the truth can serve us to that goal. But I think that's a hard lesson for both Chade and for Fitz. And it's not going to get any less heartbreaking if Dutiful ever finds out the role that Fitz played in his own birth, if that ever comes to the surface at all. But what's also very convincing in this conversation is how Dutiful brings up to Fitz that Nettle is in danger. Having the skill on the level that she has it, having that kind of power with dream skilling, not being trained, and being vulnerable to Taglia, if I'm saying her name right, the she-dragon who is stalking him, who's stalking Fitz through Nettle. Although we've seen, and Fitz has seen, how powerful Nettle is in being able to control her dreams, she's still at risk outside of her dreams, and Fitz can't help but acknowledge that. So he ends up conceding to allowing Nettle to go to the Six Duchies, to go to Buckkeep. And as a result of that, she's upset, she feels betrayed, and she's not talking to Fitz, which doesn't allow him to confess to her that he is her father. And I believe he wants to do so now. He seems to want to do so now. Whether he will have the courage to do it is another story, or how that will come about is obviously going to be revealed later in this book, I imagine. But it's so interesting how there seems to be a parallel between him not wanting Nettle to explore the skill, not wanting her to be trained in this magic that she is born to, which Ketterkin brought up in the last book. She brought up that this is who Nettle is, not to deny her identity, because the skill is part of her identity. And this is something that Fitz has wanted to deny to keep her out of danger, to protect her, but maybe he's putting her more at risk by this secrecy, by this denial. He is doing this partly because, or maybe largely because, this is the way that he was brought up. Again, going back to that theme of bringing somebody up the way you were brought up, because that's the way that Burrich treated him about his skill and his wit, and maybe even Chade as well to some degree. So there seems to be a parallel there in how he's treating Nettle with how he was treated, and also how he was trying to deny Swift. And this is also coming through with the dialogue with Webb. Everything is so perfectly revealed through the dialogue. Everything is so perfectly coming to the surface through the dialogue. And something that got me so much in the last few chapters was the scene when Swift was trying to whip bond with that animal, with that rat. I can't remember what kind of rat it was called. What was it? It was called a robber rat. And Webb is upset about this because he's been trying to teach these lessons to Swift about how important it is to consider the animal that it isn't man over animal, that there is this reciprocal relationship. The wit bond is not a man taking mastery over an animal. It is the joining founded on mutual respect for life. I love how Riddle is in the room and has to change his perception about how he understood the wit magic when it came to the bonding between animal and man, that it's not just an exploitation of animal, not like the piebalds. And Swift is struggling with this as well. He doesn't understand the danger in what he did. What danger? Is it dangerous that I might have someone that cared about me at last? Oh, that hurts so much, because you get a sense of how lonely Swift is. And it brings you back, or it brought me back to book 1 in the Farseer trilogy, how lonely Fitz was at that age as well, and how much it meant to meet Night Eyes when he did meet Night Eyes, or when he did bond with Night Eyes. And it was another dog before that, I believed, as well. There's this loneliness there that is drawing you forward, especially when you don't know any better. You don't understand anything about the wit. And of course you're going to want to use it in that way. I think it's totally understandable. So that scene, it stung. Last thing I'll say is that I appreciate the different culture and customs associated with the Out Islanders, because it's a matriarchy, but it's a matriarchy that's not simply an inverse of a patriarchy. It's a completely different culture. It's taking Fitz and others some time to acclimate, to understand the different dynamics at play, and it's not all harmonious when it comes to the women either, as we saw with the fight between Lestra and with Eliania, and also the biting, short-tempered nature of the Great Mother. You see that the men are not passive in this culture. They are warriors. They have concerns. They have a voice in what's going on. So all that said, I do appreciate the way matriarchy is explored with the Out Islands, and also the different cultural touches and the lore that's associated with the people and the importance of the land. So many fascinating things at play. So that's where I'll leave you for now, and I'll come back for the next update in the not so distant future. I meant to update right at the halfway point, but I am a little bit further than that now. I am up to chapter 22, and I'm at a very climactic moment in which we are with the Pale Woman. The Fool is being held hostage. There are several people there, several Out Islander people there, and Eliania's mother and daughter, and Rawbread, and they've all been forged. But Fitz has been kept alive. The Pale Woman has decided that rather than kill him, which has been her plan for a long, long time, she originally was trying to kill Verity and Fitz, tried to use the piebalds against him and Henya, and all that failed. And so now she's decided he's better off to her alive. And at first, her idea was to procreate with him. She spreads her legs before him. He attacks her. And now she has decided that she is going to force him to kill Icefire. But I'm still trying to understand where she's coming from and why she wants to kill Icefire. And I guess my understanding so far is somewhat echoed from what Fool has said. She talks about how, in her mind, she wants humanity to prosper and to be the conquerors of Earth, whereas with Fool, he wants the dragons to be freed in the world again, to put things in balance so that humans aren't at the top of the hierarchy, I guess. And I'm going to go back to the scene between Swift and Fool when they're in the tent. When Fitz comes up, he finds Swift and Fool in the tent, and Fool is puppeteering a version of himself to Swift. I love that. There is just such a sweetness and innocence in that correspondence. And yet Sybil comes in and makes some horrific, homophobic accusations about Fool trying to seduce Swift, which is clearly not the case, and also assumptions about the relationship between Fitz and Fool. And I love how Fool responds to that and says that Fitz is more precious to him than that. He is his catalyst, that he is the White Prophet, and he pretty much reveals his whole mission to the whole camp, which seems to coincide with what some of the Out Islanders want. They want Icefire free, or they don't want him dead anyway. This obviously conflicts with what Dutiful is here to do. Eliania buckles down that he should do it. We know why at this point, because of her mother and sister and coercion from the Pale Woman. But additionally, Swift stands up against Fool for doing this because he's loyal to Dutiful. Of course, later that changes as he gets closer and senses Icefire. But It's very sweet because Bull respects him. He tells him that he knows he will do what he believes in his heart is right. And Dutiful also accepts the Fool. Even though the mission is at conflict with his own, he still is okay with Fool as long as Fool doesn't fight with Civil. But that is in fact what happens. Fool and Civil end up fighting, and this is over events that happen in Fool's errand back when Fool as Lord Golden seduces Seidel. And of course, this was all a ploy to get away from the house to go and save Dutiful. And if it hadn't happened, Dutiful might have died, which Fool points out. He explains it was an act. Civil doesn't quite process this. In his mind, he thought that Lord Golden was very convincing. He's pretty upset about this. He feels that everything was ruined between him and Seidel as a result of that. And I just love the dialogue here because Fool brings up such an interesting point that she did not truly choose you, Civil. You were simply there, and her parents approved. Ouch. But so much truth in that. And he says that with so much compassion because there might still be hope for Civil and Seidel, but it's going to be a more powerful choice if he approaches her now and she is able to be willingly his, instead of being arranged and having no other option and never seeing another option before her. Fool as Lord Golden in that moment represented a choice she didn't know she had. And it's not that it couldn't be real. It's not that the arrangement couldn't work out, but it would be all the more powerful if it really truly came from herself, from her own heart, what she is supposed to do, what she's raised and told to do. So I just love that conversation. And I think it somewhat parallels the relationship between Ilyana and Dutiful because they didn't choose each other per se, they were arranged. And if after all of this, we'll see what happens, if after all of this and they survive, which by the way, I am hoping Dutiful survives this trilogy. Part of me has been a little scared about that for some time. But if they survive and choose each other, how much more powerful would that be, right? If that actually happens, if that can happen. But I also love the line in which Fool tells Civil, forgive her and yourself. You were trapped and used, both of you. I feel like that's so on theme for this series, especially thinking about how often Fitz has been used and used by people who care about him and knowingly used and having to forgive himself and also forgive the people who use him, but also just that understanding that you didn't know what you didn't know and you were trapped. That is so hard-hitting. That is so powerful. And through this whole entire exchange is when they start to unravel that Seidel, she possibly undid the piebald plan by exposing herself in that way, by flirting with Lord Golden, and that Seidel is innocent, but that likely her parents are not. Likely her parents are working with the piebalds. Before I move on to that, I need to talk about Thick a little bit because there's a certain point when Thick and Fitz start turning against each other. Fitz finds himself having some very bitter feelings about having to take care of Thick, being the one that is assigned this task. And it suddenly comes to his awareness that somebody is messing with his thoughts. Somebody is tapping into their skill, both he and Thick, and turning them against one another. Once they become aware of this, they make up. And they have this very beautiful moment in which they tell each other that they love each other. And I love that line. I love you too, Tom. You gave me a whistle and a pink sugar cake. Oh, it's so sweet. We also learn that Thick had this memory of his mother, and he doesn't realize what actually happened, but they're able to figure out that his mother likely tried to abandon him when he was a kid. And of course, Thick is having a hard time. He is cold, he's miserable, he doesn't want to be there. We also have a couple of encounters with the Black Man, and I find him mysterious still. He comes to the camp and disappears. They think that maybe he accepted Fool's sacrifice of honey without Fool even intending that, but Fool gets very excited and he thinks that the Black Man is incredibly important as it ties into this fate theme that's going on. Now, when Fitz consumes that courage cake, that is a very dark moment for him. He starts babbling. He starts having very dark thoughts. He wants to seek vengeance against Piotr. We find out later on, obviously, that the Pale Woman has orchestrated all this, but he feels vengeful and he controls that. He's somehow able to tap into his executive function, I suppose, and and realize through his training that it's wiser to hold back on those feelings. And he does, he succeeds in that. I want to talk about a couple more passages, a couple more exchanges as they have to do with the theme of trust. And I've been talking about trust since book one, since Fool's Errand, trust and boundaries and loyalty, how all those things are interconnected. Because Fitz cannot skill to Nettle, he is no longer able to skill at this point. He has to trust Dutiful to do it. Dutiful is going to skill to Nettle, and this makes Fitz feel so vulnerable. He is so scared about what Dutiful will reveal about him, and he asks him straight out, what are you going to tell her? And Dutiful responds, the truth. Wow, the truth. I know it's a novel idea, but I thought at least one farseer should try it. That seems to be what Dutiful is all about. He just wants the truth, and my goodness, he's around Shade and Fitz, who live their lives all about secrecy. I mean, I've already talked about that a lot in this book, but this makes Fitz so insecure. He's so scared of the truth and what the truth might do to the people he loves. That seems to be a big thing for him. As much as he's tired of secrecy, he's also terrified of being exposed and hurting people, and it's so hard for him. So he has to trust. He has to trust Dutiful. And not only does he have to trust Dutiful, but Shade has to trust Fitz, because Fitz trusts the Fool. And this is difficult for Shade to reconcile. He asks him, I thought I was your friend. He tries to pit himself in competition with the Fool for Fitz's friendship. And Fitz tells him, he says, Shade, you are more than a friend. You are my mentor and my parent and protector. He tries to explain to Shade, yeah, you mean so much to me, but Fool is my friend too, and I have to trust him. This is his whole life's work. Fool is not going to change his mind just because I tell him to. And then Dutiful sticks up for Fitz, and he tells Shade that Fitz is also a farseer, one whose vow to his family has already cost him many things. Don't we know that? Don't we know how much Fitz has sacrificed? And how much more does he have to prove himself? How much more does he have to prove himself to be worthy of that trust? And it's hard for Shade because in extending trust to Fitz, he has to, by extension, extend trust to the Fool. Yet Dutiful does trust Fitz. And it's heartbreaking because then we learn, or he learns, that Fitz was the one he skill dreamed about. Fitz and Night Eyes when he was a boy. And he says those were his favorite dreams. And Fitz admits that he did seek out Nettle when it came to skill dreaming, but that he did not seek out Dutiful because Nettle was his daughter and Dutiful was Verity's son. I don't know what it's going to do to Dutiful if he ever finds out how he was conceived, and Fitz is determined that he should never know. A couple more things. We learn from Fool how he got to the island, how he rode on Girl on a Dragon, and how Fitz puts so much of himself into Girl on a Dragon back in the Farseer trilogy, his most painful memories. And it works in such a way that Fitz is somewhat aware of these memories, but he doesn't feel the extent of the pain of these memories. That was my understanding anyway. But Fool knows. Fool says he knows the depth of the feelings that Fitz has. He's the only one who knows. The intimacy between Fitz and Fool is so beautiful to me. And I'll say I absolutely love the moment when Fool is asleep with his hand open and Fitz puts his hand into Fool's hand. Absolutely gorgeous moment. Powerful friendship there. Powerful connection. Last thing I'll mention is because Fitz doesn't have the skill at his disposal anymore, at least right now, he turns to Webb and he finally gets mentored in the wit, heightening his wit awareness. This not only leads him to sense Icefire, but it also leads him to look at Shade a little bit differently. He sees Shade's shadow and about the aloneness that trailed back behind him to his earliest years, a fate that would send him in his old age to a camp on a glacier alongside the boy he would make king. As much as I said that Fitz has sacrificed so much of himself and proven himself over and over again, Shade has as well. He has given so much of himself to the Farseer line. And I think it also speaks again to this broader theme of fate, how all these events led Shade to where he is right now. So that concludes everything I'll say for now, and I look forward to catching up again on the next update. Hello, I am up to chapter 28 in False Fate, so I'll go ahead and say that I'm at the point when Fitz is embarking on a solo quest to seek vengeance against the Pale Woman and discover what is left of Foal. And he has left Vic in the care of the Black Man, and there is a conversation that has happened about the Black Man and what happened with him. But I'm going to backtrack to where I left off in the last update and talk about some of the broad strokes moments and some of the meaningful moments as well. So when I left off last time, Fitz was released by the Pale Woman, and she wanted him to kill Icefire, and the idea is that if he killed Icefire, then Foal would live. But he goes back to camp, and one, he has an emotional reunion with Burrich, who happens to be there, and two, he notices that the others are a bit dismayed, and this is because Webb has betrayed Dutiful, sent a bird off to Bingtown to let Titaglia know about Icefire, to send help to save Icefire. Basically, they all have a discussion about what's going on, and Eliana and her uncle have a confession moment and explain why they did what they did, why Eliana asked Dutiful to do this, and what's at stake for them. Of course, we could pretty much figure that out. Then Dutiful decides that he's releasing Eliana from any of her promises because she did this in a time of deep stress and anxiety, clearly, but he will still follow through with this, and she can decide afterward if she wants to be with him. She says she does choose him, but we're going to talk about that in a minute. I hope I'm going to get the plot events in order, and I apologize if not, but basically they decide at first they're going to bring down Icefire. Dutiful's going to be true to his word. As they're going through with it, with Shade's explosives, Fitz has a revelation as to why the whole entire agenda is to kill Icefire, why the Pale Woman is asking that, why they're actually doing her bidding, and realizing the possible consequence, the war that might be at stake between the Out Islanders and the Farseers should she succeed. And I feel like this actually goes back to the first part of this book when they were talking about that being a possibility if the Icefire quest succeeds. Then chaos ensues. We have that whole battle. Titaglia ends up getting there, and there's that third forged dragon that is ignited with raw bread. Everything gets chaotic, but basically this is what ends up bringing poor Burrich down because of this stone dragon that is gaining power, and Swift shooting it with one of Foal's arrows, which actually works, and then Burrich getting him out of the way and doing this whole repel thing. The forged dragon goes down, but ends up taking down Burrich with it. So Burrich is dying at this point in the story, and I think it's so sad, but I also am not surprised by it because he's been deteriorating throughout this trilogy. Anytime we've seen him or had ideas about him, he's not been in a good state. So it's very sad, but it seemed to be like what would possibly happen. But some of the things we need to talk about with Burrich include Molly, include this whole thing about how he was the better man for her, how Burrich says that he was the better man for her than Fitz was. But he also feels sad. He feels sorry to Fitz, even though Fitz doesn't see any need for that apology. And at the end, it seems like Burrich wants him to go back to Molly. He wants Fitz to go back to Molly, and I'm thinking, nuh-uh, please don't. And I don't think Fitz wants that. He doesn't want anyone to depend on him ever again. And I didn't even mention the Nettle part of this, how Nettle got sucked into the chaos with the dragon battle, nearly died. Vic saved her. Wild. But basically, it's just been too much for Fitz, I think, at this point. He doesn't want to let any more people down. I love that there is this whole conversation that happens, because at this point, everybody pretty much knows who Fitz is. Actually, that's Shade's fault. Shade ends up calling him Fitz Chivalry in front of Swift, and Swift realizes, oh, you're him. And everybody else starts to realize, oh, okay, that is Fitz Chivalry. And I remember somebody asked him about his legacy, whether he wanted to be known and remembered, and Fitz is going to try to keep the secret to the people who are there on the island. He feels like the Out Islanders are no threat anyway. But with the people who are going back to Bugkeep, he wants Dutiful to command them to continue to call him Tom and not reveal the secret. Whatever. Like I said, I said at the beginning of this that I wouldn't be surprised if his identity came out full blown. But I really love this quote. He said, "I'd rather be forgotten for the things people think I've done, and I'd give it all if I could forget the things I failed to do." I love that, because often in fantasy, we find that the theme of legacy is so important to so many characters. This idea of being a hero so that they can be remembered for all time, or there's this importance of honoring those who came before. Fitz does not care about that. He does not feel like he has earned anyone's forgiveness or thanks or gratitude or recognition or any royal treatment whatsoever. He's okay with being forgotten because he feels like he's failed. And I think at this point in the story, it's especially sad to have lost Fool. Another thing I want to add is that I'm not at all surprised that Fitz is seeking vengeance against the Pale Woman at this point, because even as far back as when they decided they wanted to bring down Icefire and they had the explosives used for that purpose, I remember that Fitz has this thought at that point that maybe there'll be a path that goes through to the Pale Woman's place and maybe he can go there and kill her. And so he's had this thought brewing in his mind for some time. And I want to go back to the theme of love as choice, because I talked about this when it came to Civil and Seidel, how Fool brought out this idea, or proposed this idea, that maybe the love that is there will be more meaningful and true if Seidel chooses him rather than him just being the only option she ever knew. Like, that could lead to love. It's not that that can't lead to love, but love is all the more meaningful when it's chosen. And I feel like that comes up here with Dutiful and with Eliana. And I did say that in that last update, how this element of choice between Civil and Seidel could be in parallel to what's going on between Dutiful and Eliana. And I certainly do think that's the case, because as I mentioned, Dutiful releases Eliana from any obligation to marry him. He's going to do this thing freely, and then he will ask for her hand if he succeeds, if anybody survives. And she right away says, "Oh yes, I will do it, I will do it." And it seems genuine, and they have a romantic moment or two in this part of the book. Fitz seems to question that. He doesn't seem convinced by it, is the impression I get. Even later, even after they succeed and Dutiful kisses Eliana, it seems like Fitz is still questioning it. He's still wondering if she really is choosing this freely, or if this is a matter of maybe feeling like she owes him. Who knows? It seems a bit questionable to him. Like, would she choose him freely if he hadn't proposed that? There are some question marks there. There are also some question marks about the tattoos, even though they were able to heal the tattoos from her body. There was some suspicion about whether these tattoos have been accepted by her body, and Fitz seemed a little suspicious about whether she was truly healed from the influence of the Pale Woman. Magic is dirty stuff. I want to bring that up too, because the Out Islanders, they're not quite keen on magic. It seems as though Thick has changed their minds, and this leads to this situation with Burrich again, because Fitz calls the skill coterie together to try to help revive poor Burrich, to heal him after that horrible fall, after what happens in the battle. Dutiful honors this request. He tells Jade that Fitz never asks for anything, we're going to do it. And which is so loving of Dutiful. I love Dutiful. But then it doesn't work because of the skill seal that Chivalry had put on Burrich. So that prevents them from being effective in healing him. And they have to accept that he's going to die. Burrich hands over the earring. But I actually do wonder about this skill healing scene, because Webb seems supportive of it, and I question that, because I thought the whole entire Old Blood way of seeing things is that is a no-no. You do not try to make people live past their time. You let them go. You don't try to extend life. And the reason I'm thinking about that is because in Fool's Errand, that's exactly what Fitz does. He goes into Night Eyes and he gets Night Eyes to live through the skill, and that was a total violation of what Night Eyes wanted. That wounded them for a short while, and it wounded Fitz when Fool merged into him and brought him back. But the idea there is that this is not the Old Blood way of doing things. This is something that Night Eyes took in from Rolf. So again, I'm quite surprised that Webb and the other Witted were okay with this, especially Webb, because Webb is so well versed when it comes to Old Blood magic. And in a way, I almost wonder if it was for the best that it didn't succeed. Like, maybe this would have worked against what Burrich would have wanted. I mean, it's hard to know. Who knows? And of course, you got to try. I would have been upset if they hadn't tried. And I even had the thought as soon as it happened, why aren't you healing him? Why aren't you coming together and trying to skill heal him? But then once it started happening, those questions percolated. So I'd be curious if you have thoughts about that. Maybe I'm missing something there. But yeah, at this point in the story, I did appreciate learning more about the Black man. I am appreciating Thick being there, especially as it doesn't allow Fitz to go into deep melancholy and contemplate all the sad things. Thick even pulls him out at one point. He says something along the lines of, oh, what was it? It comes up in the line, you're always somewhere else. You never do the music where you are. I love that. And right away, this brings Fitz to remember Night Eyes' wisdom, the wolf wisdom of being in the present moment. I think that was such a beautiful part in which he starts to take in the scenery around him, starts to become more present. And speaking of wolf wisdom, there is a situation earlier when Swift tells Fitz that he has wolf's eyes when he talks about going back to see the pale woman in full. And he says, no wolf wastes time on vengeance. And that is what this is. Vengeance pure and simple. When people look most vicious, what you are seeing is not their animal side. It is the savagery that only humans can muster. When you see me loyal to my family, then you see the wolf. I love that passage because he doesn't make this ill motive animalistic. It's very human, a human characteristic to want vengeance, which doesn't make it good. And so it's almost demeaning to this idea of animals that this is a wolf thing to do. But point taken, and I appreciate the softness that's occurring in the dynamic between Swift and Fitz. It seems like there is so much more bonding that's occurring, and the fact that Swift wanted to stay with Fitz and help him says a lot, especially with how guarded Swift has been this whole book. I love Swift. As much as I'm curious about what's ahead on this island, I'm also curious about Buckkeep again and getting back to Nettle, knowing she's now friends with Seidel, and seeing what the dynamic will be like when Fitz arrives there, especially as everybody knows who he is, and Nettle eventually finding out that Fitz is her father. When that's going to happen, it has to happen, I imagine. But yes, like I said, secrecy fatigue. I wonder if it's all going to come to an end, but I might be wrong about that. Let's see what happens. But I'm also curious about the return to Buckkeep, because even though a ship is supposed to come back in a fortnight, I am also curious about the memory stones and whether that could be a portal. Again, I'm curious about what's going to happen on this island. That's a fool's errand, Fitz, as Dutiful said. And I will update you again when I finish the book. Hello, I finished Fool's Fate, and I am beside myself with how much I loved this book. I finished this the morning of June 1st, and I actually meant to finish this book before the end of May, and it just didn't happen. But two things I'll say is that I read the last quarter of the book within a 2-day period, which, if you know me, that is saying something because I am an extremely slow reader. And this is a chunky book, but I did take Sunday, which was the end of May. I took that Sunday and got off social media, got off my computer, and I just read. And I had the best time doing that. It was so cozy. I felt so swept away in the story. I had the best experience. I also felt like I'm reading this book at the perfect time. And I think that that's true about most books, that timing is a thing. I have a whole video about this topic, which I go into depth about. But I do think that with Robin Hopp's books in particular, they are books that should be savored, should be cherished at the right time in your life. And I feel like this one found me at the right time. The conversations that were had, the themes it touched on, just deeply touched me in such a personal way. And so I'll go ahead and start out again talking about the development, and then I'll transition to get into the overall themes of this book. Okay, so first of all, Fitz finds the Fool very dead. Fool has been tortured to death by the Pale Woman. He also finds the Pale Woman, and he decides not to seek vengeance on the Pale Woman, which was a bit of a surprise. But he does end up taking the Fool's corpse. He goes through the stone pillars. He goes to the stone garden. And we have this interesting scene where he has a whole funeral pyre for the Fool. He ends up somehow magically ending up in the crown of feathers. He ends up putting on the crown, that is, and he ends up interacting with 5 poets. I'm not sure exactly what that was all about. It's something to do with being frozen in time. The main thing is he does work very hard to resurrect the fool. And when he's resurrecting the fool right beforehand, using the skill to do so, he has this memory or insight that Burrich used the wit to resurrect Fitz back in Royal Assassin. And that was a bit of a surprise in a way, or it was meaningful in a way because we know how against the wit Burrich was, how many conversations they had with Burrich even at the end where he would not relent. He was very much against that magic, but that shows how much he loved Fitz, what he was willing to do to resurrect Fitz, how he was able to compel Night Eyes to come forward and use that magic to bring him back. Fitz does succeed. He has his fingers on the fool's wrist, and he ends up succeeding in reconstructing the fool's body. During this process, he also notes that the fool was not exactly human, but he seems to know the fool in such intimate detail doing this. When he brings him back, there's a unification that happens. He opens his eyes through the fool's body, sees himself weeping. What a powerful scene, by the way. And there's such a trauma that occurs when the fool is resurrected, when the fool comes back into his own body and realizes what's been done to him and realizes that he's there. Do you ever get past it? This is what the fool asks of Fitz, and Fitz says, no, you don't. I didn't. You won't, but you do go on. It becomes part of you like a scar. Incredible depiction of grief and trauma, because I think that's the truth when it comes to trauma and grief, is that you never fully get over these things. I think they stay a part of you. And then one of my favorite scenes, maybe my favorite scene in the whole book, is the moment when Fitz cradles the fool as closely as if he were myself, wounded and alone. I let him take whatever comfort he could in the warmth and strength of my body. I have never felt less a man that I did so. Oh, this is true love. This is true intimacy. I couldn't be more convinced about that between the fool and Fitz. I love this exchange. It's also heartbreaking because Fitz tries to use Fool's name, Beloved, and he says, will you not call me that? And he talks about how the Pale Woman tortured him with that name. They come to Girl on a Dragon, and there is this whole trauma transfer scene. And this speaks to earlier conversations where we learn from Fool that Fitz had brought some of his trauma or transferred some of his trauma into Girl on a Dragon and therefore numbed himself, dulled himself all these years to deeply feeling things, and in that way also prevented himself from feeling joy on the most heightened level. And because Fitz knows the cost of doing that, he tries to prevent a fool from doing the same, because it would be very tempting after going through the trauma of dying by torture to want to transfer that, to want to numb that. But instead of that happening, Girl on a Dragon becomes animated, she kisses the fool, transfers Fitz's trauma to the fool, and then fool kisses Fitz and transfers that trauma back to Fitz. Everything opens up for Fitz in that moment. He is able to remember so many details and take in so much information. He remembers his mother as she is mountain born, and he remembers her calling him Kepit. In Assassin's Apprentice, there is a scene when Fitz is in the market and he sees an old woman who is on a mat next to a merchant where he's interacting. This old woman calls him Kepit, Kepit, and he walks away. And I would have never caught that was his mother and that was his real name, except that Jimmy did a wonderful video about this that I saw after I read Assassin's Apprentice. And so, yeah, full circle, Kepit is Fitz's real name. It's brought up in book 1 in Assassin's Apprentice. Wild. Through this process of integrating back his trauma, there's this conversation or idea that he has become whole again. And this is very healing for Fool. He says, to see you whole again heals me. And although Fitz has integrated this trauma back again, there are still things to learn. He's still imperfect. This doesn't mean he's achieved some level of enlightenment or anything of that nature. We do learn some about the skill, and the idea behind that is that this is how people and dragons interacted or communicated in the past. Then we get this whole entire sequence where Fool is changing. He's peeling off his skin. We learn that the Pale Woman is pale because she refused to change. She wanted to change others, but she herself stayed the same. Prilcop, the black man, says that he and Fool, they've changed skin color because they prevailed. They changed. I had a bit of a hiccup, so pick it up again. I love the skill conversation between Nettle and Fitz, in which Nettle tells him about how she got Titaglia to get Icefire to display his head to the mother house, and how she feels she has a lot in common with Titaglia because they both have the same stubborn pride. And she also makes fun of Dutiful and the fact that he's so very noble. She mocks him a bit in that conversation. I laughed out loud because it's such a sibling dynamic. And of course, they just think they're cousins. And the book ends with them thinking they're cousins. But in this moment, Fitz does tell her about how Burrich died or what happened in those moments, in those final moments. But he doesn't reveal who he is, which is a failure right away. I think he should have revealed it in this conversation. And he feels like he's determined to face his life, especially after going through this trauma integration. But clearly he has some cowardice in him still, which is understandable, I suppose, because he's lived his whole life being in the shadows or pulling back or trying to be deceitful in some ways for the good of other people, not necessarily with ill intentions. But he does, in fact, go back. And when he goes back, Ketterkin gives him some wise, sage-like advice when it comes to Molly, his whole determination to go and tell Molly and the kids about how Burrich wanted him to come and take care of them. And Ketterkin says to give it time, not to go too soon. She says, let her family heal and approach her not as a man coming to take Burrich's place. Same for Nettle. You will have to find another role in her life and be content with it. That doesn't mean lie, but it does mean to be careful, be cautious, think about how you're approaching things, which he doesn't quite do well, in my opinion, but we'll get there. He does meet Nettle in person shortly after this, and she has to approach him because he's too much of a coward to approach her. And she's disappointed and a bit jealous. I love this exchange, but I feel for Nettle so much. She is so deflated in this moment because when she was hoping that maybe this would be a romantic connection, that maybe Fitz would be a bit younger. And then she finds out he's this older man. He says he's Tom Badgerlock. He doesn't reveal who he really is. And he tells her that he loves her mother, or pretty much gives that away, which is unfortunate, disappointing, embarrassing, all these different emotions for Nettle. But again, he had an opportunity and he gave it away. He could have revealed who he was. And then Patience and Lacey intersect with him. They find out who he is. They figure it out. He doesn't approach them first. They find out by accident. And this leads to an emotional reunion we've all been anticipating. I love Patience. And so it was wonderful to have that exchange. Shade and Ketterkin use Fitz to skill argue back and forth about Dutiful because Dutiful has promised Eliana to honor her wishes for more time with her mother house before they wed. And Shade sees this as not being strong enough of a leader, possibly losing respect of the dukes in the Six Duchies, that you need to be a man and tell the woman how it is. I got that idea in mind when I read that exchange, even though I know that he had the best intentions at heart and was trying to think as realistically as possible. Ketterkin did not see things the same way, and Fitz seemed to side with Ketterkin about this. He felt like Dutiful needs to learn his lessons on his own and own up to his word, and that maybe it would even be beneficial because then Dutiful could grow a little bit more. The Six Duchies, dukes can benefit from trade from the Islanders. So there are other ways to gain trust and build this alliance. And ultimately, he puts his foot down to Shade, and he owns up to his authority, to his rightful place as heir to the throne, at least in waiting, while Dutiful is going to be the king, obviously. But it was a very powerful moment, and we were thinking, wow, Fitz is stepping forward, and this actually makes Shade quite proud, but it doesn't quite last. One, because we know Dutiful becomes king pretty soon after that, but also because Fitz goes back to the Fool, thinking that they're going to reunite. He's going to take the Fool back to Buckkeep, and he goes back to the Fool, who has peeled off his skin, shows himself to be a darker skin color. He learns that Fool and Prilkop are going to go back to their place of origin, go back to the school where they're brought up and share what they've learned and talk about the dangers of the information that the Pale Woman has distributed. But the idea here is that Fool is choosing to part paths with Fitz forever. And yes, I know there is a Fitz and a Fool trilogy. I also know that the people who read this when it was first published probably found this 10 times more heartbreaking because they didn't know that would happen. They thought this would be the end. And it was still heartbreaking for me. It was such a poignant moment because the thing is, it was letting go, but letting go out of the purest love. The idea is that Foal feels if he has a place in Fitz's life, that he's going to get in the way, that Fitz is going to interact with him in a way that is going to take away or sacrifice what he could have with Molly or whatever person that he has around him. And so it would affect the whole entire cycle of fate. So the best and most loving thing to do would be to part forever. And it breaks my heart. This is such a powerful moment. And it's almost too much for Fitz to bear because he really opened himself up. He had that deep, true, intimate moment with the fool, the deepest of intimacy. To open yourself up in that way just opened you up to the pain all the more powerfully. So it's a heartbreaking parting. And Fitz doesn't see it as the end. He still has this idea that he's going to come back. He's going to take advantage of those stone pillars, despite the fact that Pro Cop has told him how dangerous it is to use those things, especially to do so within a short span of time. But Fitz gets the scrolls that are there that the Pale Woman had to bring back to Shade, and Pro Cop goes to help him. They dispose of the Pale Woman's body, the corpse that's there, to the ocean, and then Fitz goes through the stone pillar and he ends up getting sucked in there for about a month. He ends up getting spat out after a month, being very disoriented, and ends up in the infirmary where Molly goes and sees him, finds out who he is, tells Nettle who he is, and what a mess. What a mess. Nettle is pissed and she lets him know this. He takes some space to let her cool off. And that's not exactly the right approach because he spends so much time distancing himself that she has to go to him and say, okay, well, let's figure this out. But it has to be up to her. That he doesn't approach her. He just has no instinct for this kind of thing. And then he goes and abruptly approaches Molly and the family and says, your father wanted me to take care of you and I'm here to do that in any way I can. And it's so awkward. It's so awkward, and it's probably too soon is the idea that we get here too. He clearly still has so much learning to do. He's still so imperfect. And I do appreciate that, but it does leave you as a reader thinking, oh, Fitz, oh, Fitz. I also want to say that I love the moment when Shade tells Fitz that he would have died an old spider had it not been for him. That is such a beautiful, powerful moment. Starling is pregnant and a changed woman, and Hap is a minstrel. I loved getting to know Nettle and her siblings, of course. Now to talk about that reunion between Fitz and Molly, and I did have some messages back and forth with Bookborn about this. I have some mixed feelings about this. I wasn't super crazy about them getting back together. I was never fully crazy about them together in the first trilogy. Maybe even a little less crazy about her and Burrich together, only because there is that father-son dynamic between Fitz and Burrich. Regardless, I think I've adjusted to it at this point. The thing about Molly and Fitz, however, is that it was one thing that they had this deep connection or this relationship when they were teenagers. I don't even feel like they got to know each other that well as teenagers because Fitz was constantly deceiving her about what he was doing. But the thing is, all these years later, they're totally different people now. Fitz has gone through so much since then. And Molly has had 7 kids. That has to change you as a person. I wasn't totally surprised that they had a connection right away. I think that could be realistic. But what I didn't find realistic was that once they broke the ice, of course, they did have some space because of grieving over Burrich, which was good. But then after that, once they broke the ice, it didn't feel like we had any indication that they were trying to get to know each other again, or maybe even for the first time as people. Fitz notices physical changes in Molly. He notices that she's fuller in body, she has bigger boobs, she cut her hair, obviously, she has lines on her eyes, and oh my goodness, I want to bang her. That's his thinking. And Molly notices that he has maybe a couple of extra scars on him, but I didn't get an indication that they noticed other changes in maybe the way that they communicate or the wisdom that grew in each one, or a certain type of grounding that happens in adulthood versus your teen years before you've had so many kids or gone through so much. I just felt like I wanted some depth to that connection or that getting to know each other. And again, I don't feel like they got to know each other that well in the Farseer trilogy either. So I felt like it was just a little convenient. I'm not surprised they had chemistry, but I would have preferred something a little bit more in depth of getting to know a person for the first time almost. I think that would have added something for me. Now, I don't feel like you would need a whole chapter for that. You could probably accomplish that even with a line, maybe not even a paragraph. But if there was just something to allude to getting to know a person for the first time, I think that would have been more realistic and interesting to me. So that's just my personal thought about that. I was surprised that the Chalcedonian Bingtown War did not come out in the story. I was fully expecting that to come to the forefront of the story because it was introduced in book 2. And I know that people who read this book at the time it was published, they thought it was the end of the series. So I thought that was going to come forward, but it surprisingly didn't. And even the stuff with the piebalds, the interfighting between the witted, I thought that might come forward a little bit more, but it stayed more in the background. And I'm not complaining about either of those things. I actually prefer the focus that this story had. So that was not a negative for me whatsoever. One other little nitpick I have is the pale woman. Now, first, I will say I greatly appreciate the function of the pale woman in the story, the way she connected so many things, the different storylines, the way she was a connection to the Red Wars in the Farseer trilogy, the situation with the Piebalds, the situation with the Out Islanders. I thought it was brilliant the way she combined all these things. At the same time, I found her as a character a bit flat. I found her a little bit like the Wicked Witch of the West. I will get you, my pretty. Again, I think she obviously did some things that added a lot of drama to the story. What she did to Bull was absolutely devastating, so sadistic. But as a character, I wasn't as crazy about interactions with her and hearing her agenda, even though, like I said, from a plot perspective, I thought it was pretty well done. Otherwise, this was a sweeping story that I am so grateful to have read at the right time. And from here, I think will be a good transition to the themes of the story as I saw them. One of the biggest themes I took away from this story was about the weight of secrecy and how hiding truths from others, whether for their own good to protect them or for the greater good of the kingdom, might in fact be a way of hiding from oneself, of protecting oneself. And this also has to do, I think, or is in connection with trauma and intimacy, because the fact is that Fitz, even though in his mind he rationalized why he was protecting others, he had options. He could have approached Burrich as early as Golden Foal. He could have told him the truth. He even had Shade's support in doing so, and he didn't do it. And he could have prevented some of those issues between Burrich and Swift about the wit had he done so earlier, instead of having these last-minute conversations about the wit and trying to open up Burrich's mind about it in those final moments. So I feel like he actually could have saved some pain had he approached Burrich earlier and had more time with him. And the same thing with Nettle. He had some opportunities to come forward and say who he was, and it caused more pain. It caused a removal of some trust that he didn't do it sooner. So I think he made things harder on her and harder on himself by not coming forward and sharing who he was. And also the same thing with Patience. She had to figure out who he was by accident. There was no reason he couldn't have come forward to her. He could have come forward earlier, in my opinion. Yes, there is reason there. I can understand why he had to be Tom Badgerlock and remain dead to the world for so long. But I do think that he cheated some people in ways that he didn't need to. And in trying to protect them, the irony is that it hurt them more when these truths were revealed. And I also think the reason why he was thinking he was protecting them is because deep down he was trying to protect himself. Because if he opened up to others, he would have to open himself up to that vulnerability, to that pain of intimacy, because intimacy is beautiful, it's incredible. And on the one hand, we all think we want it, but on the other hand, it is so exposing and revealing, and it also leaves you susceptible to pain and grief. Pain and grief when the person has to part, like Fool had to part. They had true intimacy in that moment when he resurrected Fool's body. There was the deepest exchange of love, of knowing oneself through the other, of holding the other like you would hold yourself, a wounded version of yourself, and looking through the eyes of the other and seeing yourself. The deepest of intimacy, but it also led to the deepest of pain for that parting to happen between the two. So there is great risk in being able to do that. So on the one hand, I think it's very understandable. And I do wonder if there is a parallel between all the secrecy and deception, which he has been raised to do, which obviously Shade had a big influence on throughout his life, all of that in parallel with the fact that he did numb himself. He did take his trauma and put it into Girl on a Dragon and left himself at a distance from those deeper wounds that would open him up more. So I did see a parallel between those two things, the deception and secrecy and the trauma numbing. And it's very interesting to me that he has this thought at the end that maybe he wouldn't have slept with Starling if he hadn't been numbed in some way. That maybe he was seeking comfort, but comfort that he could keep himself at a distance in a way. That maybe he was seeking comfort through sex with Starling, but that comfort was a comfort where he could keep the other at a distance. It wasn't a true intimacy that occurred between those two. So I think that there's something profound to be said about true intimacy and exposing oneself, opening up to the wounds and the trauma. All of that seems so perfectly explored in this story. I also feel that there is a theme of love as choice versus love as obligation. And we see this in the relationship between Sybil and Seidel, the conversation that Sybil and Fool have, the argument, I should say. And it does seem to work out for Sybil and Seidel at the end. We don't go in depth about it, but we do get the impression that she does end up choosing him, that there is choice in love, and that is all the more powerful than love is obligation. And I think the same could be said about Elyania and Dutiful. There are times when Fitz is questioning whether Elyania is consenting to Dutiful based on a deeper feeling of obligation, whether she really does truly choose him or love him. But it seems to me she does, especially at the end when she comes to the Six Duchies early to marry him. And so I think that there is a bit of that theme that's explored in the story. And there's also the theme of those little nudges of good action, or even just the little choices that we make. This whole entire trilogy glimmers with these moments that seem small in the grander scheme of things, but affect the whole of everything, that influence the course of fate. And I think it's so beautifully conveyed throughout the trilogy and in this story as well. And there's also death explored in this story through Burrage's death, Foal's death, and also I would say that of renewal in contrast to death, because we have some babies at the end. Starling is pregnant. Dutiful and Elyania give birth to a baby. I think Molly's son ends up getting his wife pregnant. So there is a theme of renewal at the end. And of course, the reunion with Molly and Fitz seems to be maybe an example of that as well. So those are my final thoughts on this incredible book, this incredible journey. And I would love to hear from you in the comment section below your thoughts on any of my thoughts, or if you would like to share with me your favorite moment in Fool's Fate, please feel free to do so. Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.